12 years of service, and I thought I had finally earned the right to be seen, to be recognized not as the daughter of General Marcus, but as an officer who had worked, sweated, and bled for her country. And yet when the day of the ceremony came, when the medals gleamed under the sunlight and the flags rippled in the wind, my father called a different name, not mine, but his stepson's. The boy who had only been in uniform for 2 years and had never known what it was to sleep on cold ground or march until his feet bled, and I stood there clapping with the others, my jaw clenched so tightly I thought my teeth would crack, while the man I called father pinned the honor I had earned on the chest of someone who had only inherited the right surname, not the sacrifice, and that moment burned into me, the quiet betrayal of blood. You might think I cried, but I didn't. I didn't even let my lip tremble, because I had long ago learned that weakness was only ammunition to be used against me in that house, a house where my stepbrother was praised for breathing, while I had to prove myself twice over just to be considered acceptable. I thought back to the missions, to the nights where I stared at the stars through the scope of my rifle, whispering promises to myself that one day I'd be more than a shadow, trailing behind men with easier lives. Promises that I would never let anyone, even my own father, decide my worth. And in that moment of stolen honor, I knew the reckoning wasn't far off. It wasn't the medal itself that mattered. It was what it symbolized. The years of sacrifice dismissed with a gesture. The way he didn't even look at me as he shook his stepson's hand, as if I had become invisible, erased, an extra body in a room where I had once been a daughter. That was the moment the cold resolve settled in, and though I clapped like everyone else, my mind was already moving, already building the steps of a plan, because betrayal inside a family is a battle no one sees coming, and mine was only just beginning. After the applause faded, I slipped away from the crowd, my boots crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the back of the barracks, the air heavy with the smell of oil and dust, and I thought about every night I had pulled extra, duty when others had gone home, every mission I had volunteered for when no one else raised their hand, all so that I could be told I wasn't enough. I remembered one winter patrol where the snow soaked through my gloves and left my fingers raw and burning, where I stood guard for 12 hours straight because the replacement never showed, and I said nothing, took no complaint up the chain, because I believed discipline and silence would speak for me. But all that silence had done was give my father room to pretend my efforts didn't exist. My stepbrother, Daniel, never had to work for anything. His shoulders were never burdened by more than a textbook, and yet he carried himself in uniform as though the world owed him respect. I had trained him myself once, taught him to clean his weapon, taught him how to march without stumbling, and he had smirked at me then, the same smirk he wore now as the medal glinted on his chest. My father had raised his glass to him at the reception, his voice booming about legacy, about family, about honor, but I could see the lie in every word. That night, I lay in my quarters staring at the ceiling, my uniform jacket folded neatly beside me, and I swore to myself that I would not let 12 years be reduced to nothing, that if my father wanted to pretend his blood didn't run in me, then I would force him to see it in a way he could never deny. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I only planned. And that kind of quiet is far more dangerous than any storm. The next week brought the inspection. Rows of us standing at attention as the high-ranking officers strode past, their eyes sharp, their pens ready to note even the smallest flaw. And I felt the weight of my father's presence as he walked down the line, not as my parent, but as my commanding officer, his gaze sliding over me like I wasn't even there, pausing instead on Daniel, his proud smile flickering as though the boy had already won a war he never fought. My chest ached with the restraint of it, because I could have shouted right then, could have listed every deployment, every commendation I had earned, every scar hidden beneath the crisp uniform cloth, but I didn't, because I knew words meant nothing to a man who had already chosen the son he wished he had. Instead, I held my posture, let the silence tighten around me like a second skin, and waited for the moment when the truth would finally crack through their perfect facade. That night, I pulled my records, copies of reports signed by commanding officers, photos from operations that had nearly broken me, commendations that had been tucked away instead of celebrated, all proof that the honor had been mine to begin with. I spread them across my desk under the dim light, page after page of evidence, and I felt a cold clarity I hadn't known in years. This wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about survival, about making sure I was never erased again. My father had taught me strategy, had drilled into me the importance of precision and timing, and I would use those very lessons against him, because if he could hand my life's work to another with a smile, then I could just as easily dismantle the illusion of loyalty he built his reputation on. When the annual military gala arrived, all polished marble floors and chandeliers glinting above polished uniforms, I knew it was the stage where appearances mattered most, where my father thrived because every handshake, every toast was another brick in the wall of his reputation, and that was exactly why I chose it. Daniel strutted in beside him, the medal still pinned proudly, his smugness leaking into every step, and I kept my distance at first, watching the room ripple with admiration at the general and his golden stepson. But admiration is fragile when truth slices through it, and I carried truth folded neatly in my jacket. I waited until the speeches began, until the air grew hushed with attention, and then I stepped forward, my voice steady as I asked permission to present additional records. The room shifted instantly, curious eyes darting between me, my father, and the documents I handed to the officiating colonel, pages stamped and signed, accounts of missions that bore my name and no one else's, commendations overlooked, operations, where I had carried the weight that Daniel never touched. A silence settled, heavier than any applause, as the colonel read aloud, his brow furrowing deeper with every line, until finally he looked up, not at Daniel, not at my father, but at me. Whispers swept the hall, heads turning, and for the first time in years, I watched my father's composure falter, his jaw tightening as the carefully woven story of his favored stepson began to unravel in front of every peer whose respect he craved. And in that unraveling, I saw my revenge start to take shape, not in raised voices or shouted accusations, but in cold, undeniable evidence laid bare under the brightest lights. Daniel's face flushed crimson as the colonel's voice echoed through the hall, every word like a strike tearing the shine off the metal on his chest, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder, disbelief mixing with judgment until even the chandeliers above seemed to tremble with it. My father stood stiff, his fists clenched behind his back, but he didn't stop the reading, couldn't, not without admitting what he had done, and I saw the calculation flicker in his eyes, the recognition that his legacy was slipping away, one page at a time. When the colonel finished, the silence that followed was sharper than any blade, and then came the questions, pointed and relentless. Why had these commendations been buried? Why had Daniel received honors for missions he never served? Why had 12 years of my service gone unacknowledged? My father's lips tightened into a line. Daniel stammered excuses that crumbled under the weight of fact, and I simply stood there, straight-backed, my uniform immaculate, letting the truth speak louder than I ever could. Later, as the crowd broke into clusters of whispered condemnation, I felt the shift. People who once looked past me now searched my face with recognition, respect even, while my father avoided every gaze. Daniel slipped out first, the medal no longer gleaming but hanging heavy, almost mocking, and my father followed, his shoulders hunched in a way I had never seen, as though the uniform itself weighed too much. That night, I didn't celebrate, didn't toast or smile. I only sat alone with the quiet satisfaction that justice, once denied, had finally begun to turn in my favor, and I knew it was only the first step in dismantling the false image they had built on my silence. The fallout came fast, sharper than I even expected, because within days an inquiry was opened, formal and unforgiving, demanding explanations from my father about the misallocation of honors, about the irregularities buried in his unit's records, and suddenly the man who had always seemed untouchable was cornered. Daniel disappeared from the barracks entirely, his name whispered with mockery now instead of admiration, his once polished boots no longer seen in formation. And every time someone mentioned him, it was with a smirk that mirrored the one he had worn so proudly on stage. My father summoned me to his office, the heavy oak desk between us like a battlefield, and for the first time he didn't bark or boom, his voice low, almost pleading as he told me I was tearing the family apart, that loyalty to blood mattered. More than recognition, that I should withdraw the evidence and let the matter die quietly. I listened, my hands steady on the folder I carried, the folder that still held more proof he hadn't yet seen, And when he finished, I told him something I had never said aloud in all my years under his shadow, that respect is earned, not inherited, and that he had chosen long ago which child mattered to him, so now I was choosing myself. His jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the desk, but he said nothing, because deep down he knew the truth was already out, and no command, no threat could erase it. Walking out of that office, I didn't feel triumphant or bitter. I felt free, and freedom, after 12 years of silence, was more powerful than any medal could ever be. Weeks turned into months, and the inquiry dug deeper than even I had expected, pulling at threads my father had carefully hidden for years, unraveling not just the lie about Daniel's medal, but a whole tapestry of favoritism, misallocated funds, and overlooked failures that he had papered over with his rank and reputation. Officers who once toasted him now kept their distance, their greetings clipped and formal, their eyes avoiding his in corridors where he used to command respect with a single glance. Daniel tried to salvage what little dignity he had left, parading himself in the city in uniform, but civilians whispered too. Families of soldiers who had fought beside me came forward with their own stories, their own records, and suddenly, it wasn't just my voice carrying the truth, it was dozens of others who had felt the weight of being ignored while someone else was given the glory. I stayed quiet through it all, refusing interviews, refusing to let the narrative become about revenge or bitterness. I let the facts speak, and that silence was louder than any defense my father attempted. One evening, as I left the base after another long day of testimony, I passed by a group of young recruits, their eyes following me with something I had never felt before, respect untainted by my father's shadow, respect for me, for my years of service, not for the bloodline I carried. That night, I sat in my small apartment, away from the suffocating walls of his house, and thought about what those 12 years had really cost me. Not just sleepless nights and scars, but pieces of myself I had given away in the hope that one day my father would see me. And yet, in the end, it wasn't his recognition that mattered. It was that I had forced the world to see me on my own terms. My father was suspended pending review, stripped of his command until the board's decision, and Daniel vanished entirely, the medal no longer on his chest but shoved into a drawer, a relic of a lie too shameful to display. And for the first time, I felt the ground beneath my feet as my own. Not borrowed, not conditional. I knew this was not the end. The hearings would continue, the fallout would spread, but I also knew I had already won the only battle that truly mattered. I was no longer invisible. The hearings stretched on, dragging through endless transcripts and testimonies, every session peeling back another layer of the image my father had built brick by brick over decades. And though he walked in, each morning in full uniform, shoulders squared, the weight of disgrace bent him lower with every passing week. He tried to hold on to control, tried to insist that decisions had been made for the good of the unit, that Daniel's recognition had been an administrative oversight, but the paper trail was merciless, and I watched as generals who had once raised their glasses with him now turned their questions sharp as blades, dissecting his every word until his excuses crumbled. Daniel became a ghost, his name muttered only in sarcasm, his face absent from every duty roster, and I later heard he had left the service altogether, unable to face the humiliation of being branded a fraud before he had even built a career. For me, the days blurred between quiet satisfaction and unexpected sorrow, because dismantling my father's facade didn't erase the part of me that had once wanted nothing more than his approval, and each time I saw his eyes duller than the day before I knew I had broken something that could never be fixed. And yet, it wasn't my hand that had broken it. It was his, the day he chose bloodline politics over sacrifice, the day he taught me that loyalty without respect is just submission. When the board finally delivered its judgment, suspending him permanently and revoking his honors, the room fell into a silence that felt like the closing of a door, heavy and final, and in that silence I stood taller, because for once the truth had outlasted the lie. Walking out of the hall, sunlight striking against the brass buttons of my jacket, I realized that my revenge had never really been about taking something from him. It was about taking myself back, piece by piece, until I no longer needed him to see me, because the world already did. After the verdict, the base seemed different, quieter, as if the air itself had shifted now that the shadow of my father's authority no longer lingered over every corner. And for the first time in years, I could walk through those halls without feeling weighed down by a name that had never truly belonged to me. Younger officers stopped me, not with pity, but with gratitude, some pressing my hand as they whispered, "Thank you for speaking when they couldn't, for tearing open a system that had silenced them too," and each word carved deeper into me the realization that what I had done went far beyond personal revenge. At night, though, when the lights dimmed and the uniform hung on the chair beside my bed, I would think of my father alone in that vast house, stripped of rank, his walls lined with empty frames where medals had once hung, and a part of me mourned. Not for the man himself, but for the father I had once believed he could be. It struck me that all those years I had mistaken his coldness for discipline, his silence for strength, when in truth it had only ever been weakness disguised as authority. A man so desperate to shape an heir in his own image that he ignored the child who had already surpassed him. Letters arrived from commanders I had served under, formal commendations now restored to my record, each one a reminder that my sacrifices had not been in vain, and with them came offers, new positions, new opportunities, doors opening that had long been closed. I stood at the threshold of choice, continue climbing in the world of uniforms and salutes, or finally step outside the cage of legacy that had defined me for too long. And as I packed my few belongings into a duffel one evening, I realized that the greatest honor I could claim was not a medal, nor a title, nor even vindication. It was the freedom to choose a life that was wholly mine, untouched by my father's shadow, unbound by his disappointment. When I finally signed my release papers, the pen felt heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried, because it wasn't just ink on a page. It was 12 years of discipline, sweat, and sacrifice being folded into the past, and for the first time in my adult life, I was stepping into a future that wasn't dictated by my father's name or the Army's chain of command. The officers who processed my discharge shook my hand with respect, some even with admiration, and I left the building with my duffel over my shoulder, the evening sun painting long shadows across the pavement, as though even the earth itself was reminding me that I had walked through darkness and come out whole. I rented a small cabin far from the barracks, nestled near a stretch of forest where silence was not the heavy kind I had known in uniform, but the gentle kind that let me breathe. And in those first weeks, I relearned the simple rhythms of living. Waking to birds instead of bugles, running because I wanted to, not because it was ordered, cooking meals that tasted of freedom rather than rations. Yet the past lingered, not as chains, but as lessons etched into me, each scar on my body a reminder that survival was my true honor. And I began writing, pouring out 12 years of stories onto paper, not to seek glory, but to leave behind a record that couldn't be stolen or reassigned. Word of my father reached me occasionally, his appeals denied, his name slipping from relevance as fast as it had once commanded fear. And though some expected me to revel in his downfall, I found no joy in it, only a hollow confirmation that the man I had once longed to please had built himself on illusions too fragile to last. My revenge had never been about destroying him, it had been about reclaiming myself. And now that I discovered that the sweetest victory was not in watching him fall, but in knowing I had risen, stronger, freer, untouchable in a way he would never understand. Months passed, and with each sunrise over the quiet forest, I felt more like myself than I ever had in the rigid confines of service, as though the uniform had been a second skin I had finally shed, leaving me raw but alive. The manuscript I was working on grew thicker, pages filled with memories of nights in hostile terrain, the faces of comrades who had stood beside me, the weight of decisions that had carved lines into my soul. At first, I thought it was only for me, a way to bleed out the silence I had carried for so long. But when a former comrade visited and read a chapter, her eyes shone with something between pride and grief, and she told me the world needed to hear it, that our sacrifices deserved to be remembered in truth, not distorted by medals pinned on the wrong chest. That was when I realized my story had power beyond revenge, that it could be a weapon sharper than any rifle, a shield for those still serving who feared their voices would never be heard. Offers came from publishers, invitations to speak, to share what it meant to give years of your life and still stand unseen. And at first I hesitated, fearing that stepping into the light would drag me back into my father's shadow. But I learned quickly that this light was mine, not borrowed, not stolen. My father's name faded from headlines, his disgrace now a closed chapter, while mine began to appear in ways I had never imagined. Not as the general's daughter, but as an individual who had carved her own path out of betrayal and silence. One night, after a reading, a young soldier approached me, his voice shaking as he thanked me for giving him the courage to speak about his own struggles. And in that moment, I understood. My revenge had transformed into something larger, a legacy built not on the hollow applause of a rigged ceremony, but on truth, resilience, and the refusal to be erased. I walked home beneath a sky clear with stars, the same stars I had once whispered promises to during lonely watches, and I smiled to myself knowing I had kept them, not by earning his recognition, but by proving I never needed it. By the time a year had passed, the cabin no longer felt like an escape, but like a beginning, a place where I built something that belonged only to me. My book was published, its cover plain, its words raw, and to my surprise, it struck a nerve far beyond the military world, reaching people who had never worn a uniform, but who knew what it meant to be overlooked, silenced, betrayed by the very ones meant to protect them. Letters poured in, stories from women who had endured being dismissed in their own families, from soldiers whose courage had gone unrecognized, from daughters who had lived in the shadow of fathers that never saw them. Reading them, I realized I was no longer alone, and the revenge I had once thought of as personal had become a beacon for others who carried the same invisible scars. My father's name was a ghost now, spoken only in hushed tones among those who still remembered what he had lost. While Daniel had disappeared completely, his glory erased as if it had never existed, and I no longer flinched at either mention, because neither of them defined me anymore. Instead, I found myself on stages, speaking not of medals or ranks, but of resilience, of the quiet power of refusing to be erased. And every time I looked into the crowd and saw young faces listening, I felt the weight of 12 years turn into something lighter, something that finally made sense. One evening, after a long talk, I stood outside under the hum of city lights, watching people stream past with their own burdens and battles, and I thought back to the girl I had been, clapping in silence while her father honored another, and I whispered to her across time, "You were never invisible." And for the first time in my life, I believed it. 2 years later, I returned to the capital, not in uniform but in a simple dress, walking streets that once felt suffocating but now seemed smaller, almost fragile compared to the battles I had already fought within myself. A memorial service was being held for fallen soldiers, and though part of me hesitated to attend, fearing the weight of memories, I knew I had to, not for recognition, but for the comrades whose faces still haunted my dreams. The square was crowded, flags snapping in the wind, names etched into stone gleaming in the afternoon sun, and as I laid a wreath among the others, I felt a quiet peace, the kind that doesn't come from victory but from survival. People recognized me, not as the general's daughter, but as the author, the veteran who had dared to speak, and I accepted their handshakes with a humility that came from knowing the cost behind every word I'd written. Somewhere in the distance, I caught a glimpse of my father, older, diminished, sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the crowd. No medals on his chest, no followers at his side, just a man stripped of illusions. For a heartbeat, our eyes met, and there was no anger in me, no triumph, only a hollow acknowledgement that whatever bond we might have had was long gone, severed the day he chose legacy over love. I turned away before he could rise because I didn't come for him, and walking into the sunlight, I felt the weight of my past fall behind me like an old shadow. Revenge had carried me this far, but now I lived for something greater, for truth, for those who had no voice, and most of all, for the woman I had finally allowed myself to become, free, seen, and unshakably whole. Years later, when my hair had begun to silver at the edges, and the sharpness of youth softened into something steadier, I found myself invited to speak at an academy ceremony, the same kind of event where I had once stood ignored, clapping for someone who had stolen my honor. Standing at the podium, looking out over rows of cadets in crisp uniforms, I felt the weight of time fold in on itself. But this time, the spotlight wasn't stolen. It was given freely because I had earned it. I spoke not of glory or medals, but of endurance, of what it meant to be unseen and to rise anyway, of the battles fought in silence that shape a person more than applause ever could. The room listened in rapt attention, not because I was anyone's daughter, but because I was my own person, and when the ovation came, it wasn't hollow. It was real, and I carried it like a flame I could pass forward. Afterward, a young woman approached me, her eyes fierce but uncertain, and she whispered that her family never believed she would last in service, that they expected her to fail. I took her hand and told her the truth I had bled to learn. They cannot erase you unless you let them. Her shoulders straightened, and in that small moment I saw my legacy taking root, not in the halls my father once ruled, but in the resilience of those who came after me. Later, walking alone beneath the fading light, I realized I no longer thought of my revenge as a story of destruction. It had become a story of rebuilding, of turning betrayal into fuel for a future that was bigger than my pain. And though the past still lived in me, it no longer owned me. I had outgrown it, and in doing so, I had won in every way that mattered. By the time a decade had passed, I had lived enough lives to almost forget the sharp sting of that day when my father pinned the honor on Daniel instead of me. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, the memory would rise unbidden, not with the same burn of betrayal, but as a reminder of the fork in the road that had shaped everything since. My life had expanded far beyond the barracks, far beyond his shadow, into places I never thought I'd see. Conference halls where people listened, universities where young cadets studied my case as a lesson in integrity, shelters where I sat, with veterans who carried invisible wounds heavier than any uniform. My book had grown into more than a single volume. It became a series, each page carrying not just my story, but those of countless others who entrusted me with their truths, and together those stories formed a chorus too loud to be silenced. The government eventually instituted reforms in recognition and awards protocols, quiet changes that most people overlooked, but I knew where they had begun, in the fracture of one man's deceit and one woman's refusal to be erased. I built a new home by the coast, a place where the sea stretched endlessly, reminding me daily that freedom was not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice. And in that salty air, I learned to breathe without the weight of rank or expectation pressing against my ribs. Sometimes, letters still came addressed to General Marcus's daughter, relics of a past that refused to die entirely, but I would open them, smile at the assumption, and then slide them into a drawer where they would gather dust because my identity no longer needed correction. It was already carved into the world in ways no dismissal could undo. When people asked if I ever forgave my father, I told them the truth. Forgiveness was never the point. What mattered was that I forgave myself for waiting so long for his approval, for believing that my worth could be measured in his eyes. And in that release, I found the deepest kind of peace, one that outlasted revenge, outlasted grief, outlasted even the scars of service. The girl who once clapped in silence had become a woman whose voice carried across nations, and that transformation was the real victory, one that no medal, no general, no father could ever take away. When 20 years had passed, the edges of memory softened, and the bitterness that once fueled me had turned into something steadier, quieter, like embers that no longer burned but still gave off warmth. My father had long since retreated into obscurity, a man no longer spoken of with respect or even resentment, just forgotten. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in textbooks that young cadets studied with the same detachment they reserved for ancient battles. Daniel, too, had faded into the background of life, his name erased from every honor roll, his existence marked only by the shame of what he had once tried to claim. I no longer followed their stories, because my own had grown far larger than theirs could ever have been. I had lectured across oceans, sat with leaders who sought my counsel on integrity and leadership, watched as my words reached those who still stood in ranks under unforgiving suns, reminding them that their sacrifices mattered even when recognition failed. My coastal home became a sanctuary, filled with photographs not of medals or ceremonies, but of people. Smiling cadets, veterans who had found strength again, readers who had sent me their stories after mine gave them courage to speak. Sometimes, when the tide was low, I would walk barefoot along the shoreline, the water cool around my ankles, and I thought about the young woman I had been, standing silent as her father honored someone else. If I could reach back across time, I wouldn't change what happened, because that moment, painful as it was, had been the fire that reshaped me. Revenge had once been the word I clung to, the fuel that kept me standing when the weight of betrayal threatened to crush me. But what I carried now was something greater, something freer. My story no longer belonged to him, or to Daniel, or even to the military. It belonged to me, and to every person who had ever been told they were invisible, every woman who had been passed over, every soldier whose sacrifice had been silenced. That, I realized, was the true ending. Not triumph over a father, but triumph over the silence he had tried to trap me in. And standing there, with the sea stretching endlessly before me, I finally understood that I hadn't just survived his betrayal, I had outlived it. And in doing so, I had written a life that was wholly, unmistakably my own. In the twilight of my life, as gray streaked fully through my hair and my hands bore the fine lines of years spent carrying burdens both seen and unseen, I found myself invited back once more to the academy where it all began. The hall was crowded with cadets, young and sharp-eyed, the same age I had been when I first believed my father's approval was the only currency that mattered. They greeted me not with salutes to a general's daughter, but with respect for the woman who had stood her ground, who had refused to be erased. And when I spoke, my voice steady though softened with age, I told them not the story of my revenge, but the story of resilience. How betrayal can break you or it can build you, and the choice lies always in how you rise from it. The ovation was long, heartfelt, and as I stood there, I realized it was not applause for a battle won long ago, but for the life I had shaped in its aftermath. Later, walking slowly through the gardens on the academy grounds, I paused beneath the same oak trees I had marched past countless times in silence, and I let myself breathe in the stillness, no longer carrying the weight of a name that once felt like a shackle. My father was long gone by then, buried without fanfare, his stone unvisited, his legacy diminished to dust, and Daniel's fate remained unknown, his name never spoken in the circles that mattered. And yet none of that stirred bitterness in me anymore, because their absence was no longer my victory. My existence was. The revenge that once consumed me had become something else entirely, a quiet testament that I had taken back my life, piece by piece, and lived it on my own terms. Standing there in the fading light, cane in hand, I whispered a promise to the young woman I once was. We did it, and we did it without needing them. And with that truth burning steady inside me, I walked on, content, knowing the story had finally come to rest. In the final chapter of my journey, when the years behind me far outweighed the ones ahead, I often sat by the wide window of my coastal home, watching the tide roll in and out, steady as breath, and I thought about how far I had come from that day of betrayal. The girl who once stood in a hall clapping for another had grown into a woman whose name was known not for borrowed glory, but for truth, resilience, and the refusal to vanish. My shelves were filled not with medals, but with books, letters, and photographs, testimonies of lives touched, voices emboldened, changes made because one woman decided she would not stay silent. Sometimes young officers still visited, their faces bright with questions and hope, and I would pour tea and tell them not about rank or orders, but about the strength it takes to stand alone, the honor in carrying scars without shame, the power of refusing to let anyone else define your worth. At night, when the ocean air cooled and the stars stretched across the black sky, I would remember the girl I had once been, longing for her father's nod, aching for his approval, and I would smile gently because that girl had no idea she was destined for a life so much greater than his shadow. My father's name no longer hurt, Daniel's memory no longer stung. They had faded into irrelevance, while my life had expanded into something luminous, a legacy not of bitterness, but of endurance. And as the waves whispered against the shore, I felt the deepest peace I had ever known, the kind that comes when revenge has long since melted into wisdom, and wisdom into freedom. My story was never really about them. It was about me. And in the quiet of those final years, I finally understood that surviving had been the greatest victory of all, As the years wound down into a slower rhythm, I found myself more often in reflection than in motion, the ocean outside my home marking time in tides instead of calendars. And I realized that the true arc of my life had never been defined by a single act of betrayal, but by how I chose to rise from it. In my 80s, my days were filled not with ceremonies or stages, but with letters from people across the world who had read my books, heard my lectures, or simply stumbled upon my story and found a mirror of their own struggles inside it. They wrote of fathers who had dismissed them, of institutions that had silenced them, of years spent waiting for recognition that never came, and they wrote of how my defiance gave them permission to stop waiting, to seize their lives instead, of begging for acknowledgement. I read each one slowly, sometimes with tears, sometimes with laughter, always with the deep gratitude that my pain had not been wasted, that it had been transformed into something that could outlast me. My body weakened as all bodies do, but my mind stayed sharp, and I poured it into one final manuscript, not about battles or betrayal, but about legacy, the kind you build not through medals or monuments, but through courage, kindness, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. When it was published, the reception was quiet but profound, and I knew I had laid down the last stone of the path I had been carving since that day in the ceremony hall. I no longer thought of my father, except in fleeting memories. And when I did, it was not with rage, but with a distant pity for the smallness of his vision, for the blindness that kept him from ever seeing the daughter who could have been his proudest legacy. Daniel was a name I had not spoken in decades. His life as irrelevant to me as the dust beneath the waves. And as the sea breeze moved through my open window, carrying the scent of salt and eternity, I understood at last that the story of my life was never truly about revenge. Revenge was only the spark. What endured was transformation, survival, and the quiet strength of knowing I had lived fully, freely, without apology. And in that knowledge, I felt ready for the final chapter, not with fear, but with the calm certainty that my story had already outlived me. In the final stretch of my life, when the body had grown frail but the spirit remained unbroken, I found myself most at peace in the evenings, sitting by the great window of my home with the ocean stretching endlessly before me. The waves rolled in and out like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, and I thought about the journey that had carried me here. From the rigid parade grounds where I was made to stand invisible, to the echoing halls where my voice finally shattered, the silence to this quiet sanctuary where no one could ever again diminish me. I had lived long enough to watch generations grow, to see young soldiers enter service with fire in their eyes, to witness daughters stand taller than fathers who once dismissed them. And in those moments, I understood that my story had become something larger than myself. It had become proof that betrayal does not have to define you, that you can rise from the ashes of someone else's denial and build a life radiant with your own light. The bitterness that once burned so hot in me had long since cooled into something steadier, like iron forged by fire. And what remained was not anger, but wisdom. I had learned that revenge is not always about destroying someone else. It is about refusing to let them destroy you. My father had gone to his grave without ever asking for forgiveness, without ever acknowledging the wrong he had done. And Daniel had long since faded into the anonymity of failure. But I did not carry their shadows with me anymore. Their absence was not my victory. My life was. The books I had written, the speeches I had given, the countless young people who had written to tell me that my defiance gave them courage, those were my true medals, each one brighter than the polished brass my father once withheld. In my last years, I began to write letters to my younger self, sealing them in journals that I left for those who would come after me. I told that young woman, tired, overlooked, aching for approval, that her worth was never measured by a father's nod or a medal pinned to her chest. I told her that she would survive, that she would not only be seen but remembered, and that her silence would one day give way to a voice powerful enough to echo long after she was gone. Those journals became my final gift, not to myself, but to the future, because I wanted the next generation of women, soldiers, and daughters to know that they were never invisible, not truly, not if they chose to rise. As the seasons turned and my days grew slower, I found comfort in the simplest things: the laughter of children playing on the shore, the feel of salt wind on my face, the quiet companionship of those who visited, not because of who my father had been, but because of who I had become. And when the time finally came, when the horizon blurred and the sea seemed to merge with the sky, I was not afraid. I had carried my story through fire and silence, through betrayal and redemption, and I had laid it down in the world like a seed. What grew from it would outlast me: resilience, courage, the unshakable truth that no one has the power to erase you unless you let them. And so, in the end, my life was not the story of a general's daughter left in the shadows. It was the story of a woman who claimed her own light, who turned pain into strength, who transformed betrayal into a legacy of survival. That was my revenge, my victory, and my peace. And as the tide whispered against the shore one final time, I let it carry my story outward into the vastness, where it would live on long after I was gone.